The man nobody asked anymore. I still think there's a flaw in the priority algorithm. Frank heard his own voice in the silence that followed and knew at once that he should have let the thought stay where it had been, inside his own head, unshared, unexposed, safe. The conference room held still around him. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A styrofoam cup tipped slightly in someone's hand and stopped. Across the table, Amy looked up from her laptop with a patience that was worse than anger. She stood, took a marker from the tray beneath the whiteboard, and walked to the front of the room. No rush, no visible irritation, just the clean, efficient movement of someone who already believed the interruption belonged to a lesser category of problem. She drew 3 boxes and connected them with arrows. Input, she said, tapping the first box. Then the second, pattern. Then the third, priority. She turned back to him. This is the simplified version. Nobody moved. Frank remained standing beside his chair. He could smell dry erase marker and stale coffee. On the other side of the wall, the plant kept going. Faint conveyor rhythm. A distant pneumatic hiss. The steady life of the factory continuing without concern for what happened in meeting rooms. Amy gave him a thin smile. Do you understand that, Frank, or do I need to draw a chicken? The words landed hard and flat. Nobody laughed. That might have been easier. Nobody spoke either. Frank looked around the room once. Men he had known for years kept their eyes lowered or fixed too intently on notebooks, or on the grain of the table, or on nothing at all. Jake sat with one hand near his keyboard, expression unreadable, as if he had decided the safest place to be was slightly outside the moment. Mark was at the head of the table, shoulders tight, mouth set in the shape of a man who knew something was wrong and had already chosen not to interrupt it. Frank pushed his chair back. The scrape of metal legs against the floor sounded louder than Amy's voice had. He walked to the door and left. No one called him back. Frank R. was 68, a mechanical engineer who had spent 35 years inside the Toledo plant and had once believed that kind of time earned a man a permanent shape in a place. He was a widower now, living alone, his back bent slightly, his hands no longer as steady as they had once been. The factory had become the structure of his days and, in ways he tried not to examine too closely, the structure of his identity. By the time Amy humiliated him in front of a room full of people, he had already begun to feel himself being edged out of that world without anyone saying so plainly. 5 weeks earlier, he was on the plant floor at 5:42 in the morning, one hand resting against the housing of a temperature sensor, listening. That was still how he trusted a machine, not by a dashboard, not by a report, not by a clean digital trend line with colored flags beside it. He trusted sound, vibration, delay. A line had a rhythm when it was healthy. Belt, click, lift, release. A pause where there ought to be a pause, not where one had started to grow by accident. That morning, line 4 had developed the slightest hitch, one beat dragging against the next. Most people would not have heard it. Frank did. He loosened the sensor bracket with a wrench, adjusted it by less than a quarter turn, then stood still again. Better. The factory around him was still waking up. Overhead lights came on in strips, turning the concrete a pale industrial gray. Safety yellow railings threw back a tired shine. Forklifts beeped in reverse, somewhere down the far aisle. The air smelled like grease, coffee, warm dust, and old metal cooling from the night shift. Tom came up beside him with a paper cup in one hand and his jacket still on. You hear the news? Frank kept his eyes on the sensor a moment longer. Depends which bad news. Tom let out a small breath that could have been a laugh. Detroit's sending a team down. That got Frank to straighten. For what? Tom shrugged. Digital transformation, that's the phrase they used. Frank wiped his fingers on the rag at his belt. That phrase usually means somebody at corporate found a new way to ruin a perfectly good week. Tom sipped his coffee and winced at the taste. Apparently this one's different. They always say that. AI. Frank looked at him. Tom lifted his brows. That's what I heard. Frank glanced down the length of the line. Sensors, panels, housings, wiring. 20 years of patching and recalibrating and nursing systems through winters they were never built to survive. Machines that lied in familiar ways when the temperature changed too fast. Equipment with habits. Equipment with moods. The kind of things nobody put into presentations because nobody in Detroit wanted to hear that machines behaved differently when you had lived with them long enough. He bent, tightened the bracket, and stood again. Fine, he said. Tom studied him. Doesn't sound fine. It's not my first reform. Tom gave that the brief nod of an old friend who understood when a sentence was meant to end a subject, not continue one. Mandatory meeting at 10. Frank made a face. That alone tells me it's bad. Could be worse. How? Tom took another sip, looked into the cup like maybe the answer was in there and said, could be mandatory training. Frank said nothing. Tom grinned. See, there it is. Frank looked back at the line, listening once more. It was steady now, for the moment. At 10 o'clock, the meeting room upstairs was too cold and too bright, the way rooms built for compliance tended to be. The tables had been arranged in a squared-off U. A monitor at the front displayed a company slide with blue gradients and a slogan about operational excellence. Coffee sat in an urn near the door and had already passed whatever fragile point divided coffee from something medicinal. Frank took a chair along the side rather than the center. Not hiding, not volunteering. Mark introduced himself first. Mid-30s maybe, clean beard, clean boots, quarter zip over a collared shirt. A voice trained to sound respectful in rooms that did not owe him respect. He thanked everyone for making time. Nobody answered. He clicked to the first slide. The company, he said, was launching a modernization effort across multiple facilities. Toledo would be one of the first sites. The goal was to improve maintenance timing, reduce downtime, better predict failures before they happened, and move the plant into a more efficient operational future. Frank had heard enough versions of the future in his life to know it usually arrived with fewer promises than slides. Then Mark introduced Amy and Jake. Amy stood with one hand resting lightly against the table. Amy Chen, systems engineering and machine learning. Her voice was quick, controlled, and completely untroubled by the room's indifference. I'll be leading predictive modeling implementation on site. Jake gave a shorter introduction. Jake Mercer, data integration and diagnostic support. He looked younger than Mark, with the relaxed face of someone who assumed most resistance was temporary and mostly uninformed. He smiled once, briefly, when he said diagnostic support, as if the phrase amused him. Mark moved on through the slides. Diagrams, timelines, phrases like adaptive monitoring and predictive optimization. Frank looked at the screen, but more than that, he looked at the people speaking. Amy barely glanced at the workers. Jake glanced too much, but not with interest. Mark kept trying to bridge the room with tone alone. When the slide for line 4 came up, Frank leaned forward. A simplified diagram of the thermal regulation section appeared on the screen with small labels for sensor clusters and data flow. It was clean, too clean. The line on the screen had none of the grease, none of the lag, none of the little mechanical lies the real one carried. We'll start by building baseline behavior from historical operating data, Mark said. From there, the system can identify anomalies and prioritize intervention before a failure event becomes a downtime event. Frank lifted a hand. Mark looked relieved to have a concrete question. Yeah? What about thermal drift in the older sensors? Amy answered before Mark could. The new system isn't going to rely on legacy sensor logic the way the current process does. Frank turned toward her. Then what does it rely on? Multivariable pattern recognition. That's not what I asked. A stir moved around the room. Not speech, just chairs adjusting, a throat clearing, Tom somewhere to Frank's left shifting one boot against the floor. Amy folded her hands loosely. It compares signal relationships across the line. With what anchor? The model establishes baseline correlations. Frank kept his voice even. Based on what? If the source reading is already wrong? Jake looked down, maybe at his laptop, maybe to hide a smile. Frank could not tell. Amy's expression changed only slightly, not enough for most people to see. But Frank saw it. The moment patience thinned into contempt. Frank, she said, the point of the system is that it's not limited by the old single-point assumptions. I'm not talking about assumptions. We'll walk everyone through this in training. Frank stayed on her. I'm asking now. Amy let out a breath through her nose, barely audible. You're asking from inside the old framework, she said. That's the issue. The room went still in a different way then. Not because the sentence was loud, because it had rank in it. Frank looked at Mark. Mark stepped in, but softly, too softly. I think what Amy's saying is we'll have a fuller technical review in the training session, and, No, Frank said. Nobody expected him to interrupt. Mark stopped. Frank kept his eyes on the slide, and I know what she's saying. That was all. He did not raise his voice. He did not add anything else. But the line had been drawn, and everyone in the room knew where it was now. Mark moved on, too quickly. The meeting finished without another question from Frank. When people stood, the room broke into small currents of motion. Some workers headed straight for the door. Some slowed to talk to each other in low voices that stopped when one of the newcomers looked their way. Tom lingered long enough to catch Frank's eye, then looked away again. Not avoidance. Warning, not here. Frank waited until the room had thinned before he stood. As he stepped into the hall, he passed Amy and Jake standing near the whiteboard. Jake was saying something under his breath. Amy answered without lowering her voice quite enough. He's exactly the kind of bottleneck they warned us about. Frank kept walking. His office was hardly an office anymore. Just a cramped corner partitioned off from the old drafting area, with a desk that predated most of the software upstairs and a rack of rolled blueprints that no one had asked to remove because no one cared enough to. The window beside his desk looked out toward the plant floor through glass that had long ago given up trying to be clear. He shut the door halfway and sat. The training packet had already been dropped on his chair. Predictive Maintenance Interface Overview. He stared at the title for a moment, then opened it. The first page was tolerable. Definitions. A schematic. Some language trying too hard to sound simple. The second page was worse. Terms layering over terms. Confidence scoring. Anomaly thresholding. Weighted signal relevance. Dynamic prioritization. Every phrase seemed to assume a previous fluency he did not have. Frank read a paragraph once, then again, then a third time slower. The sentence still refused to settle into meaning. He took off his glasses, wiped them with the edge of his shirt, put them back on, and tried again. The page did not improve. Outside the half-closed door, footsteps passed. Voices. One of the younger engineers from Process said, "No, but if the old data's junk, the model's gonna spend weeks learning noise." The other one laughed. "Then it'll fit right in here." Their voices faded. Frank stared at the page. A strange feeling came over him then, quiet enough that he almost missed it at first. It was not anger, not embarrassment exactly. Something duller, and therefore harder to push away. For most of his adult life, he had entered rooms knowing exactly what he knew and exactly how much that was worth. He had spent decades being the man people called when a line began acting wrong in a way nobody else could name. He had taught younger engineers how not to trust neat readings from dirty systems. He had known, by sound alone, when a bearing would fail before the shift ended. Now he sat alone at his own desk, looking at 5 pages of material, and could not follow the language well enough to tell where it was shallow and where it was serious. For the first time in a long time, he felt not merely uninformed. He felt stupid. The word came, and he rejected it immediately, almost physically, the way a man rejects a bad taste. But it had already touched down. He shut the packet. His left hand made a small, restless movement against the desk, fingers shifting once before he curled them in and stilled them. He looked at the hand a second too long, then turned his chair slightly and fixed his eyes on the old blueprints hanging by the wall. There was one for a conveyor housing retrofit from 15 years ago. His notes still ran along the edge in block handwriting. Corrective alignment, heat expansion offset, rework bracket, real words, machine words, things a man could point to. His desk phone rang. "Tom." Frank picked up. "Yeah." "How bad was it?" Frank leaned back in his chair and looked through the cloudy glass toward the floor below. Belt movement. A pallet jack crossing an aisle, a flash of safety vest. "It was a meeting," he said. Tom waited. 30 years of friendship had taught him how to wait through the first lie. Frank gave in. The engineer, Amy, she talks like everything in the place is already obsolete, including the people. Tom made a low sound in his throat. "That tracks." "She cut me off." "That also tracks." Frank looked at the packet on his desk. "There's training Thursday." Tom was quiet for a beat. "You going?" Frank wanted to say of course. He almost did. The habit of competence was still stronger than pride in some parts of him. But the packet lay there in front of him, and he had already read enough to know he had not understood enough. "I'll be there," he said at last. Tom heard something in the pause before it. "You okay?" Frank's eyes stayed on the packet. "I'm fine." Tom did not argue, which only made the lie feel thinner. By late afternoon, the plant had settled into that end-of-shift mood when noise became emptier rather than softer. The work still happened, but the edges of it grew loose. Frank stayed at his desk longer than he needed to, trying to force himself through a few more pages. He underlined 2 phrases he still could not have explained back to anyone. Eventually, he stopped pretending the packet was helping. Outside, the sky had gone the color of cold steel by the time he drove home. His house was small and orderly in the way houses often became when only one person lived in them long enough. He set his keys on the counter, set the packet beside them, and stood a moment in the kitchen without taking off his coat. The refrigerator hummed. A photo of his late wife was held to the door by a chipped magnet. She had been dead 10 years. In the picture, she was smiling at whoever had taken it, not at the camera itself. as if the real moment existed just to one side of the frame. Frank looked at the photo the way he often did, briefly, then longer than intended. His daughter lived in Chicago. She had asked more than once whether he would ever consider coming there, at least for a while, maybe for good. He had always answered in a tone that ended the subject. He opened the refrigerator and took out a beer. The bottle was cold enough to bite at his palm. He stood at the counter and opened it, then drank before he had fully decided to. He did not usually drink alone on weeknights. Not as a rule. There had once been rules that organized evenings. Those had gone thin over the years, some disappearing without ceremony, others remaining out of habit alone. The phone rang while he was still standing there. Tom again? Frank picked up. What? You sound friendly. What do you want? Tom ignored that. I heard one of the floor guys say training Thursday is going to be mandatory. Frank took another swallow of beer. That's what they said. You still going? Frank looked at the packet on the counter, then at the photo on the refrigerator, then through the kitchen window into his own dark reflection. He could retire. That fact had been sitting near him for months now, sometimes farther away, sometimes close enough to feel like a hand on his shoulder. He could take early retirement. His daughter had room for him. He could leave Toledo, leave the plant, leave the endless fluorescent noise and cold mornings and lines that required listening with the whole body. He could step out before somebody younger pushed him out more cleanly. He could, and yet the thought of the factory without him did not feel like relief. It felt like something being taken. Tom waited. Frank said, I'm not going to let a bunch of kids tear this place apart. The line stayed quiet a second. Then Tom said, all right. Another pause. I'll keep an eye on things. Frank did not answer right away. Tom was not a man who liked open declarations. He did not enjoy conflict. He knew exactly how much boldness a paycheck could tolerate and usually stayed on the safe side of that line, which meant that when he said something plain, it mattered. Frank said, yeah. Tom cleared his throat. See you in the morning. After the call ended, Frank stood alone in the kitchen, the beer half gone, the packet unopened on the counter, his wife's picture still watching from the refrigerator door. Outside, Tuesday evening settled over the neighborhood without event. No storm, no sirens, no sign that anything had changed. But something had. Not the plant, not yet. Just him. He lifted the bottle again and took a long drink, longer than he meant to, the cold bitterness going down too easily. Then he set it beside the packet and looked once more at the photo on the fridge. See what they're doing to our plant, he said. The kitchen remained quiet. He stood there with one hand on the counter until the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of conveyor rhythm in his memory began to sound almost like the same thing. And for the first time in his life, on a Tuesday night, Frank drank alone. The lesson. Today we're going to learn the new dashboard. Amy stood at the front of the small meeting room with one hand on the mouse, the screen behind her already awake with colored boxes and moving charts. The monitor cast a cold wash of light across the table. Somebody had brewed coffee half an hour earlier. The smell had already gone burnt. A vent overhead clicked and pushed out dry air that never seemed warm enough in winter and never stopped in summer. Frank took the chair nearest the end of the table because it let him see both the screen and the door. Amy glanced at him, then at the printout in front of her, though she clearly didn't need it. Frank, she said, have you ever worked with a CSV file? She said the letters separately, not fast, not slow, exactly the pace a person used when they wanted the room to notice they were simplifying. Frank looked at the screen instead of at her. I've worked with production data. Jake made a small sound beside his laptop, not a laugh, close enough to count. Amy nodded as if she had expected that answer and had already filed it away under predictable. Okay, she said, that's not really what I asked. Mark was there too, seated farther down, a legal pad open in front of him. He had taken off his jacket and rolled his sleeves to the forearms, as though that might make him look more plant-adjacent. He kept his eyes on the screen. Amy clicked to the next view. A grid appeared. Columns, filters, tiny labels along the top. A panel on the right with live metrics changing every second. This dashboard pulls inputs from the line, compares current behavior against expected behavior, then flags maintenance priority based on probability weighting. She looked back at Frank. The raw exports can be reviewed in CSV format when needed, but most people won't have to touch that layer. Most people. Frank rested his hands flat on the table. I keep the temperature records by line and shift. Yes, Amy said. By hand? It was not said with curiosity. Jake leaned back in his chair and spun a pen between his fingers. Do you know what an API is? Frank looked at him. Jake's face was easy, almost friendly, which made it worse. Men were easier to read when they committed to being rude. Frank said, Application Programming Interface. Jake smiled. Right, so you did Google it. Frank felt the back of his neck go hot. I didn't say I didn't know it. Jake lifted one shoulder. Sure. Mark cleared his throat. Let's stay on the workflow. Amy nodded without looking at him. Right, so, Frank, what we need first is for you to understand where the priority score is coming from. She pointed to the upper left panel. See this? He saw a colored box labeled Thermal Anomaly Risk and 3 numbers under it. 1 green, 1 yellow, 1 red. The labels were smaller than they needed to be. Maybe to fit more on the screen. Maybe because no one designing software ever imagined someone his age trying to read it from 6 feet away. I see it, he said. What does it tell you? Frank leaned forward. The line name was there. The current throughput percentage. A maintenance suggestion rank. A confidence number. Under that, a compact graph showing a climb and slight drop over the last 8 hours. It says line 4 has elevated thermal risk, he said. Amy gave a small nod. And? He frowned. And it says not to stop the line yet. Why? He read again. Because confidence isn't high enough. Good. Amy clicked another tab. Now tell me what's feeding that score. Frank scanned the lower panel. There were abbreviations he didn't know, shortened labels. A small icon he assumed opened another layer. Sensor cluster, comparative variance, throughput normalization, historical deviation. The words arranged themselves into meaning slowly, then began slipping apart again. He kept his face blank. Jake watched him over the edge of his laptop. Amy waited 3 seconds too long before saying, "It's okay. You can just say you don't know." Frank looked at the screen one moment longer, then at her. "I'm reading it." "Yes," she said. "I can see that." The room stayed quiet after that. The vent clicked again overhead. Tom had passed Frank on the floor 10 minutes earlier and given him nothing but a glance. That was probably smart. If Tom came in now, if he saw this, he would either pretend it was normal or fail to pretend, and Frank was not sure which would be worse. Amy moved on. She showed him where the system ranked work orders, where it folded multiple variables into one priority band, where historical trends sat behind the main panel. Every few minutes, she would stop and ask him to repeat back some function that had barely settled in his head before she had buried it under the next one. Open the event history. Frank moved the mouse. No, not there. He moved it back. The tab on the left. I see it. Then click it. He clicked too low. The panel didn't open. Jake gave a quiet laugh into his hand. Frank moved the cursor again, more carefully this time, and opened the history view. Amy said, "Okay, now filter by thermal class." Frank's fingers rested on the mouse. He saw the filters. He saw the drop-down. But the cursor drifted slightly right before he corrected it, and he hated that Amy saw that too. "Top bar," she said. "I know where it is." "Then use it." He clicked, opened the wrong menu, closed it. Jake's chair creaked as he leaned back farther. "This is pretty basic." Mark looked up from his pad. Jake. Jake lifted both hands a little. "What? It is?" Amy did not tell him to stop. Frank opened the correct filter and selected thermal. The view changed. A list of past flags appeared, each with timestamps and severity numbers. He read the top entry. The line speed was attached to each event. So was ambient temperature. He looked at the sequence more carefully. Something in the order felt wrong. Amy was already talking again. Now, if you click any event, you'll see how the system weighted it against historical patterns and... Go back. Amy stopped. What? The list, go back. She stared at him a second, then clicked back to the list view. Why? Frank leaned closer to the screen. That one, open it. Amy clicked the flagged event from the previous week. A detail pane opened. Historical deviation, signal clustering, priority rank, recommended response. Frank looked at the throughput number, then the thermal variance, then the weight assigned to each. He said nothing. Amy waited. Do you have a question? Frank did not answer right away. The event had occurred at highline speed, over 70%. The dashboard had flagged the temperature rise, but the priority score had stayed lower than it should have if the speed multiplier had been treated the way he would have treated it. At that throughput, a thermal drift problem could spread bad parts faster than the system seemed willing to assume. Or maybe he was reading it wrong. He could not tell yet, and that bothered him more than Amy did. Jake said, "You see something, or are we just pausing for atmosphere?" Frank ignored him. Amy clicked back out of the event before he had finished looking. "We'll get into model behavior later. Right now, I need you to understand basic navigation." Frank turned to her. "Why is line speed weighted that low?" Amy's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Irritation, sharpened by the fact that he had asked something specific. "It's not weighted low," she said. "It's balanced against other factors. At 70 plus throughput? Yes. That doesn't make sense. Jake let out a breath that turned into a laugh. There it is. Amy kept her eyes on Frank. The model isn't a gut feeling, it's multivariable. Frank looked back at the screen. At that speed, a temperature drift hits the lot before the machine tells you it's hit. That's exactly the kind of old reactive logic this system is replacing. He heard the sentence, but what stayed with him was the phrase, old reactive. She had not raised her voice. She did not need to. The words came out with the confidence of someone used to being believed before the proof arrived. Frank said, if the line's moving that fast and thermal's already off, you don't wait for confidence. Amy folded her arms. You're assuming one variable should override the rest. I'm assuming scrap is expensive. Jake laughed outright at that. Yeah, I think finance figured that out already. Mark looked at the screen, then at Amy. He seemed to be deciding whether this counted as useful friction or the wrong kind. In the pause, he chose the safer interpretation. Maybe we note the concern and move on, he said. Frank kept staring at the event pane. Note the concern. Amy took a breath through her nose and shifted back into demonstration voice. Fine. Frank, can you open the comparative trends panel? He didn't move. Frank. He put his hand on the mouse again. The cursor drifted slightly as he brought it across the screen. He corrected it. Clicked, missed the icon. Clicked again. Not much. Barely anything. Enough. Amy was watching his hand now, not the screen. He opened the trends panel. Two graphs appeared. One of them showed throughput, the other thermal variance. They moved almost together, diverging at the upper range. He felt something unpleasant turn over inside him. Not because the graph proved him wrong or proved him right, because he needed an extra second to make sense of it, and Amy saw him needing it. She said too brightly, would it help if I slowed down? Frank kept his eyes on the graph. No. Jake said, maybe print it in bigger font. Mark wrote something on his legal pad and did not look up. Amy stepped closer to the table. Let's do this another way. Frank, tell me what you'd do if the system generated a yellow thermal flag at 62% throughput. Frank answered without thinking. Check the sensor before I trust it. And if the system still ranked it yellow after cross-signal review, I'd still check it. Why? Because the line lies. Jake snorted. Amy looked almost pleased now, as if he had confirmed something she wanted confirmed in front of witnesses. The line doesn't lie, she said. People misread it. Frank looked at her then. Jake shifted in his chair, smiling at the table. Mark finally looked up. For a second, Frank thought mistakenly that he might say something useful. Instead, Mark said, I think the point is just that the new system asks for a different kind of trust. Frank stared at him. Different kind of trust. That was management language, the kind that turned risk into posture. Amy nodded once, as if Mark had restored order properly. Exactly. She went on from there. More menus, more panels. She had Frank open and close the same screens until the motions became clumsy through repetition. Every time he hesitated, she filled the space a little too quickly. Every time he answered correctly, she moved on before the correctness could settle into the room. Jake kept making little comments, soft enough not to be formally offensive, pointed enough to do their work. When Frank asked Amy to bring back the event with the high throughput flag, she said, we're not doing model critique today. When he asked where the waiting table lived, Jake said, maybe let's master clicking before we get into architecture. Once, while Frank searched for a collapsed panel, his left hand made that small, unsteady shift against the mouse again. Amy's eyes dropped to it and lifted back to his face without expression. That was worse than if she'd smirked. By the time the session had gone an hour, the room smelled stale and overused, as if the air itself had been through too many meetings. Mark checked his watch. Amy saw it and shut the panel with a sharp click. Okay, she said. I think that's enough for today. Frank took his hand off the mouse. For a second, no one said anything. That might have been the end of it. Bad enough, but survivable. Then Amy leaned back against the table, crossed her arms, and said, with a half laugh she didn't bother hiding, honestly, we should probably just retire him early. She did not look at Mark when she said it. She looked at Jake. Jake laughed immediately. Not hard, not wildly, just enough. Frank did not move. The vent clicked again overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past, rattling over the seam in the floor. Mark's pen stopped in his hand. He looked at Amy, then at Frank, then at the table between them. He said nothing. That was the part Frank would remember later with the most clarity. Not Jake's laugh, not Amy's face. Mark's silence, which had shape to it. It occupied the room like another person. Frank stood up. He gathered nothing. He had brought no notebook, no folder, no coffee cup he needed to take with him. He pushed his chair back carefully so it wouldn't scrape, though his hand wanted to do the opposite. Amy uncrossed her arms. Frank, he walked to the door. Jake was still smiling when Frank passed him. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights felt harsher than the ones inside. The plant noise came back through the walls in pieces. Forklift horn, metal contact, the distant repeating pulse of a conveyor. He stood there a second, one hand flat against the cinder block beside the door, waiting for the urge to go back in and say something unfixable to pass. It did not pass, it only changed shape. He walked downstairs instead. On the floor, the line gave him what the room upstairs had not: sequence, resistance, cause, and effect. He went to line 4 and checked the temperature housing himself. Ran his hand along the bracket. Looked at the old sensor mount. Listened. Tom appeared at the far end of the aisle, slowed when he saw Frank, then came over with the caution of a man approaching an injured dog he knew by name. How'd it go? Frank kept his eyes on the panel. Fine. Tom glanced at him once. Yeah? Yeah. Tom didn't believe it, but he also didn't ask again. Not immediately. He looked toward the mezzanine, where the training room sat hidden behind concrete and fluorescent light. Then back at Frank. You need me to cover 6 for 10, I can? I said I'm fine. Tom nodded, small and careful. All right. He lingered a moment longer, then walked off. Frank stayed with the sensor. He looked at the readout, then at the line speed, then down the moving belt toward the next station. Parts passing under light, one after another, each one becoming expensive by the second if something upstream was wrong. Maybe Amy was right. The thought came hard and fast, then sat there. Maybe he was too old for this. Too slow. Too fixed in habits he had mistaken for skill because they had worked long enough. Maybe the extra second he needed in front of the dashboard was the truth, and everything else, his irritation, her arrogance, Jake's little laughs, was just noise wrapped around it. He tightened the bracket unnecessarily and stepped back. The line kept moving. At lunch, he sat alone in his office and opened the training packet again. He forced himself through pages he disliked on principle and now disliked personally. Terms still stacked on terms. He wrote 2 definitions on a yellow pad just to prove he could retain them. Then he went back to the flagged event in his memory. High throughput, thermal anomaly, lower priority than it deserved, or lower priority than he thought it deserved. He tried to picture the screen exactly, the graph, the percentages, the recommendation, the way the 2 lines had started together and separated when the speed rose. He closed the packet. Through the cloudy glass beside his desk, he could see only motion and color. Safety yellow railings, gray floor, a blur of blue jacket passing. The plant had always made sense to him from the inside out. Today, for the first time, it seemed possible that sense itself had shifted while he was looking somewhere else. Late in the afternoon, Mark stopped by the office. He stood in the doorway, knuckles touching the frame once before he spoke. You got a minute? Frank did not invite him in, but Mark came halfway anyway. I wanted to make sure, Mark said, then paused, probably hearing how thin that sounded. I wanted to check in on the session. Frank sat back in his chair. Did you? Mark glanced toward the blueprints, the desk, anywhere but directly at him for a second. Amy can be blunt. Frank said nothing. She's under pressure, Mark added. That almost made Frank laugh. Is that what that was? Mark shifted his weight. I'm not saying she handled it perfectly. No, I'm saying there's a learning curve here for everyone. Frank looked at him a long moment. For everyone, he repeated. Mark seemed to hear too late what he'd said. That's not what I meant. Frank's gaze moved to the doorway behind him, the hall, the plant beyond it. Then say what you meant. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, then settled for something smaller. I think it'll get easier. Frank looked back at the desk. That was answer enough. Mark took it. He gave a short nod and left. At home that evening, the kitchen seemed smaller than usual, though nothing in it had changed. Same counter, same refrigerator hum, same photo on the fridge door, his wife smiling slightly away from the camera. Frank stood there with one hand on the counter and did not take off his coat for several minutes. He did not open a beer this time. Instead, he took the old notebook from the drawer by the phone, a brown covered one he had once used for maintenance notes, part numbers, temperatures, dates, the kind of record nobody had asked him to keep, but everybody had eventually relied on. He carried it through the kitchen and into the garage. The garage smelled like cold concrete, motor oil, and cardboard that had taken on damp one winter too many. A single pull-chain bulb lit the workbench in a cone of yellow that left the corners in shadow. On the pegboard above the bench hung tools he still used, and tools he kept because throwing them out felt too close to admitting something. He sat on the stool by the bench and opened the notebook. Most of the earlier pages were old line notes, replacement intervals, sensor drift patterns in January. A bad month in 2018 when the thermal housing on line 2 had cracked twice before anyone in procurement believed the supplier had changed material grade. His own handwriting filled those pages in compact block letters. He turned to a blank page. For a while, he only looked at it. The house behind him was quiet, no television, no second set of footsteps, no reason to hurry. Then he wrote at the top, Day 12. He stopped, pen hovering. Day 12 of what exactly he did not define. The rollout, the nonsense, the campaign, it didn't matter. He wrote again, Priority gap, thermal events at throughput above 70%. He paused and remembering the screen, the graph, the event details. He could still see the numbers imperfectly, but the pattern was clear enough. He wrote more slowly. AI appears to underweight temperature variance when line speed increases, treats throughput as stabilizer instead of multiplier. He sat back, then leaned forward again and added, Will miss bad lot risk if sensor drift begins under high volume run, likely 5-6 weeks before a major scrap event, if not corrected. The words looked different on paper than they had in his head, more serious, less deniable. Frank read the lines once, then again. The garage heater clicked but did not turn on, just the sound of trying. He closed the notebook. His hand stayed on the cover a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned off the light and sat in the dark garage for a few seconds before going inside. The shape of the new page still present in his mind, like something he had already done and could not take back. Me. Frank crouched near the base of line 4 with a piece of white chalk in his hand and a gray crescent of dust on one knee. The concrete was cold through his work pants. The line moved beside them with its usual steady noise. Belt, click, lift, release. While he drew a rough square on the floor and marked off 3 smaller ones inside it. Not a real diagram, just enough to hold the parts of it in place while he explained. Tom stood over him with his coffee, looking down. So, Frank said, drawing an arrow from one box to the next, if thermal starts drifting here, and the line speed's already up, the bad parts don't pile up slow. They stack fast. Tom squinted at the chalk. That's the one from the dashboard? That's what I'm saying. Frank tapped the second box with the chalk. They've got speed sitting in the wrong place. System treats it like a smoothing factor. He drew another arrow, shorter this time. At low throughput, maybe fine. At high throughput, no. That should kick the priority up, not hold it down. Tom took a sip and winced at the taste. You sure that's what it's doing? Frank stayed crouched a second longer, looking at the chalk marks, at the line of his own hand, at the simple, clean logic of one thing making another thing worse. No, he said. Tom blinked. No? Frank stood up slowly, pressing one hand to his thigh before it straightened fully. Not sure enough. Tom waited. Frank wiped chalk dust on the side of his pants. I saw one event, maybe 2 if I'm remembering right. Could be I'm missing something in how they're weighting it. Tom looked at the floor sketch again. But if I'm not missing it, they've got a hole. The line moved on beside them, indifferent. A forklift horn sounded from farther down the aisle. A pallet jack rattled over a seam in the floor. The air held that familiar blend of warm metal, grease, and bad coffee. Overhead, fluorescent light made everything look thinner and a little tired. Tom shifted his cup to the other hand. You tell Mark? Frank snorted once. What? I told him enough. Tom looked toward the mezzanine offices and lowered his voice, though no one was close enough to hear them. You should tell him the specific part. I did. Frank rubbed the chalk between his fingers until it squeaked faintly. He heard what he needed to hear. Tom said nothing to that. Frank bent and added another line to the floor. Look, here. If thermal variance starts climbing while throughput's above 70, you're not buying yourself time by waiting. You're buying scrap. Tom nodded slowly. From the corner of his eye, Frank saw movement in the aisle. Jake, walking past with his badge clipped to his belt and his phone in one hand, head bent as though he were checking a message while crossing the floor. He did not slow down. He did not look over. He kept going toward the far end of the line with the casual, absent shape of somebody not involved. Frank turned back to the chalk drawing. It's not complicated, he said. Tom gave him a dry look. Then why's it got 27 screens? Frank almost smiled. Almost. Because if they made it simple, nobody'd pay for it. Tom let out a short laugh. Frank continued, tapping each box again as he spoke. Bad sensor drift. High speed. Thermal gets treated like noise because the model thinks speed explains the variance. That's backwards. Speed makes the variance more dangerous, not less. Tom's gaze stayed on the concrete. You really think it's that clean? No, Frank straightened again. Nothing's that clean. He tossed the chalk onto a nearby cabinet ledge. It rolled once and settled. Tom looked up. You writing any of this down? Frank hesitated just long enough for Tom to notice. Yeah, he said. Good. Tom looked as if he might say more, then thought better of it. He tipped his cup toward line 6. I gotta get back. Frank nodded. Go. Tom started away, then turned back once. For what it's worth, you're probably right. Frank watched him go, for what it was worth. By early afternoon, the floor had settled into its usual rhythm. Men moved between stations. A maintenance cart squealed past with one bad wheel. Somebody on line 2 cursed at a stripped bolt, then laughed when the wrench slipped and barked his knuckles. Ordinary noise. Ordinary roughness. The kind of day that ought to have been survivable. Frank spent most of it half inside his own head, checking readings, comparing what the screen said to what the line said, carrying the chalk diagram with him without wanting to. Once, crossing the aisle near the break room, he saw 2 younger techs glance at him and then away too quickly. Not unusual. He had become more visible by becoming the wrong kind of visible. Still, it lodged somewhere. At 3:15, his desk phone rang. He picked it up. Yeah. Tom didn't answer right away. Frank looked toward the cloudy window beside his desk. What? Tom said, "You got C." Slack? Frank frowned. What's that? A pause. Then Tom exhaled through his nose, the way he did when he had hoped not to be the one saying something. Internal chat, Tom said. Company thing, messaging. I don't use it. Yeah, I know. Frank sat back in his chair. The training packet was still on the desk where he had left it that morning. Along with his notebook and a yellow legal pad with 2 terms on it in block handwriting he no longer needed to look at to resent. What? Tom was quiet again, which was answer enough already. What? They put up a video. Frank held the receiver tighter without meaning to. What video? Tom cleared his throat. You, on the floor. For a second, Frank thought of the training room, of Amy, of Mark not saying anything. Then he said, doing what? Explaining the thermal thing. Frank looked at the desk, at the pencil, at the coffee ring and the wood veneer that had been there since before Jake was born. How? Somebody recorded it. Frank did not ask who. He knew before Tom said it. Tom went on, voice lower now. It got posted to one of the plant channels. Frank said, what's it say? Tom hesitated long enough to make the silence ugly. Tom said, when your grandpa tries to explain the internet using the post office. The room around Frank stayed very still. The fluorescent light above his desk gave a faint insect hum. Somewhere out on the floor, a metal bin dropped and clanged once, then again, settling on its side. Frank said, how many? Tom did not answer. How many people saw it? Tom said, a lot. Frank waited. Then Tom, quieter, pretty much the whole plant, Frank. Frank looked through the cloudy glass into the blur of movement outside. Men walking past, a safety vest, somebody carrying a case of parts. The plant continued as if nothing had changed, which for them, maybe nothing had. He said, did you watch it? Another pause. Yeah. Frank nodded once, though Tom could not see him. Take it down, he said. Tom said, I can't. I don't even know if it's still up. I heard about it from... Frank hung up. He sat without moving for several seconds, the receiver still in his hand before he set it back in the cradle. Slack. He did not know what it looked like. He did not know where it lived, whether on a phone or computer or both, whether there were menus or channels or if channels were just folders with a different name. He knew only what Tom had told him. Somebody had recorded him while he was talking on the floor, and now 200 people, maybe more, maybe less, but enough, had watched him become a joke in a place where he had once been an answer. He opened the top drawer of his desk and looked inside as if the shape of that would help. Pens, a flashlight, old work orders, a folded pair of reading glasses. Nothing in there had changed either. Outside in the hall, 2 people passed, one saying, "No, I'm telling you, the caption," and then both voices dropped, moved on, disappeared. Frank shut the drawer. He stayed until the end of the shift because leaving would have felt like admitting something. He walked the floor, checked a sensor, signed off on a maintenance note, answered one question from a line lead in a voice that sounded ordinary enough to him that he almost resented it. No one said anything to his face. No one needed to. He could feel the shape of it now in the quick glances and the way conversation bent around him without breaking open. At one point, Jake passed him near the tool cage carrying his laptop under one arm. He smiled in that easy, loose way of his, as if they shared no history at all. "Hey, Frank." Frank looked at him and said nothing. Jake kept walking. That night at home, the kitchen seemed brighter than usual because the rest of the house was dark. Frank stood by the counter with his work boots still on and stared at his phone. It was an old one. Good battery, loud enough ringer. Mostly he used it for calls, weather, the occasional message. He unlocked it, stared at the screen, then typed Slack into the search bar and got nothing useful. Then he typed company chat, then plant Slack. Then he stopped. The refrigerator hummed behind him. The photo of his wife remained held to the door by the same chipped magnet. Her face caught in the same half-turn away from the camera, as if she had been interrupted and had not minded. Frank put the phone down. He did not need to see it. That was the part that made it worse. If he had seen the video, he could have hated a thing, its angle, its timing, the sound of his own voice, the caption, the faces in the replies if there were replies. But not seeing it left the humiliation loose in his head, able to become whatever was worst. He opened the refrigerator, closed it again without taking anything out, then went to the sink and stood with both hands braced on the counter. After a while, he picked up the phone again and called Tom. Tom answered on the second ring. Yeah. How long was it? What? The video. Tom was quiet. Maybe 30 seconds. Could you hear what I was saying? Most of it. Frank stared at the dark window over the sink. His own reflection hovered there, faint and flat. Did they laugh? Tom took too long. Frank said, did they? Some people did. Some people. The answer was almost kind. Frank looked at the phone screen in his hand. All right. But Frank had already ended the call. He slept badly and woke before the alarm. At the plant the next morning, the sky outside the loading bay doors had the wet gray look of snow that might arrive and might not. The floor was colder than usual. Men came in with shoulders hunched, carrying their coffee like a second piece of equipment. Frank did not go to line 4 first. He went upstairs. Mark's office was not much of an office either, though newer than Frank's. Glass on one wall, a metal desk with no dents in it yet, 2 framed certificates, a monitor docked to a laptop, the faint smell of printer toner and new carpet that had failed to kill the deeper factory smell underneath it. Mark looked up when Frank knocked once and entered without waiting for the answer. Frank. Frank closed the door behind him. Mark set down his pen. What's going on? Frank remained standing. You know about the video. Mark's expression altered in a small, practiced way. Not surprise. Recognition arranging itself into concern. I do move, he said, and I already told Jake to take it down. No. Frank looked at him. Mark added, it's been handled. Handled. Frank said, has it? Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, then thought better of it and leaned forward again, forearms on the desk, trying to look engaged rather than defensive. Frank, I understand why you're upset. No. Mark paused. You understand why I came in here, Frank said. That's different. The office stayed quiet. Through the glass wall, someone passed carrying a stack of binders and did not look in. Mark said it was inappropriate. Frank waited for the rest. When it didn't come, he said, that's it. Mark's jaw shifted once. What do you want me to say? Frank looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a forklift horn sounded faint through the walls. Then the low drag of something heavy being moved. Finally, Frank said, do you think that's how you treat someone who gave 35 years to this place? Mark's eyes dropped to the desk, then came back up. No. But it came too fast, not from conviction, from the need to answer. Frank saw that too. Mark went on him, I'm not defending the post. You are. I'm not. You are. Mark rubbed a hand once over his mouth. Jake's young. Frank said nothing. He didn't think. Frank looked at him. Mark shifted in his chair and it was stupid. He took it down. Frank let the silence lengthen until it became uncomfortable enough that Mark started to fill it. I talked to him, Mark said. He understands it can't happen again. That was when something small and final moved into place inside Frank. Not dramatic, not rage, just a clean loss of expectation. He had come here, though he would not have put it in words. For one thing, for Mark to say it had been wrong in the plain way wrong, things were wrong. No cushioning, no age excuse, no talk about Jake being young, as if youth were a temporary permit for cruelty. Mark had not done it. Maybe he could not. Maybe men like him had trained themselves out of the ability. Frank said, you don't get it. Mark's face tightened. I'm trying to... No, Frank shook his head once. You're trying not to have a problem. Mark looked away first this time, toward the glass wall, toward the hallway, toward anywhere this conversation might turn into procedure instead of what it was. Frank, he said softer now, I need this team working together. There it was. Not I need to make this right. Not I should have stopped it. Working together. The phrase of a man more frightened of friction than damage. Frank looked at him another few seconds. Then he said very quietly, you two. Mark frowned. What? Frank kept his eyes on him. You're like him. Mark straightened. That's not fair. Frank gave the smallest movement of one shoulder, not quite a shrug. Fair had nothing to do with it. He turned and opened the door. Behind him, Mark said, Frank. Frank stopped in the doorway but did not turn. We'll do better, Mark said. Frank stood there long enough to make Mark hear the silence after it. Then he left. The floor seemed louder when he got back downstairs. Or maybe it only seemed that way because he no longer expected anything from the upstairs offices and the machinery had resumed its proper size in the world. Line 4 clicked and lifted and released. A casing on line 2 rang faintly under impact. Someone laughed near the break room, and though he could not hear the words inside it, his body assumed for a second they belonged to him. Tom caught up with him near the old parts cage. "You see, Mark?" Frank kept walking. "Yeah." "Well?" Frank stopped beside the tool cabinet and checked a clipboard that did not need checking. Tom looked at his face and took a half step back. "All right." Frank signed the clipboard line, set the pen down. He took it down. Tom waited. "That's it." Tom nodded once, slow. "Yeah." Frank looked toward the line. Tom lowered his voice. "I'm sorry." Frank said, "For what?" Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing useful to put after that. By evening, the house had gone dark around him again. He did not turn on the television. He did not open the training packet. He ate standing up and could not have said what the food tasted like. Later, he sat at the kitchen table with the old brown notebook in front of him, turned to the page he had written the night before, and read the lines again. Day 12. Priority gap. Thermal events at throughput above 70%. AI appears to underweight temperature variance when line speed increases. Treats throughput as stabilizer instead of multiplier. Will miss bad lot risk if sensor drift begins under high volume run. Likely 5-6 weeks before major scrap event, if not corrected. He rested his fingers on the edge of the page. Not corrected. He had tried the ordinary path, or enough of it to see the shape of the outcome. Raise concern. Ask the question. Bring it to the room. Bring it to Mark. Wait for some version of the institution to prefer truth over convenience. It would not. He closed the notebook and carried it into the garage. The bulb over the workbench came on with its usual weak yellow pull. Concrete floor, metal shelves. Winter smell trapped in old cardboard. On the pegboard, tools hung in their places with a patience he trusted more than he trusted people. A socket set. Wire cutters. Torque wrench. A coil of spare cable. A small plastic bin of sensor housings and parts the plant had written off years ago, but never asked for or back. Frank stood there a long time without touching anything. Then he opened the lower cabinet under the bench. Inside, beneath a cracked case of drill bits and an old rag stiff with oil, was a box of spare temperature sensors. Not new, but serviceable. Backups he had kept from an older batch, because he disliked throwing away working things merely because somebody else had updated the inventory list. He took one out. Then another, set them on the bench under the light. The housings were familiar in the hand. Weight, threading, connector shape. He turned one over, thumb rubbing the seam where the casing met the mount. There were ways to make a sensor read a little different without making it fail. Ways to push a line of data, not far enough to look broken, just far enough to expose what a system did when reality stopped behaving politely. He opened the top drawer and took out a jeweler's screwdriver, a strip of fine abrasive cloth, and a small calibration shim he had not used in years. On the bench lay the notebook, closed now. On the bench lay the spare sensors. Frank sat down on the stool and pulled the nearest one toward him. He began to work the casing loose with slow, careful turns, the metal giving in quarter turns, then smaller ones, until the seam opened just enough to let him see inside. The garage was quiet except for the faint tick of cooling metal and the dry scrape of tool against housing. Up in the house, the refrigerator hummed through the floor. Frank did not hurry. He adjusted the contact surface by degrees too small for any dashboard to call dramatic. He set the first sensor aside, picked up the second, and checked the fit of the shim against the inner plate. By the time he stopped, 3 sensors lay on the bench in a neat row, altered in ways an algorithm would read before a person would. He looked at them for a while. Then he turned off the overhead light and left them there in the dark, waiting. The chicken. By the time Mark called his name, Frank already knew the room had been arranged against him. Not formally, not in any way a man could point to and make stick. But he felt it all the same in the shape of the tables, in the extra chairs pulled in from storage, in the way Amy had chosen a seat with a clear path to the whiteboard, in the way Jake had his laptop open before the meeting even started, already smiling at something private on the screen. The conference room was too full for comfort and too cold to blame it on the number of bodies. Burnt coffee sat near the door. Somebody had brought in donuts no one was touching. 20 people, maybe a few more. Supervisors, engineers, line leads. 2 young maintenance techs Frank barely knew by name. Tom along the sidewall with a cup in his hand and his shoulders already set in that guarded way that meant he wanted to be elsewhere. Mark stood at the front under the monitor, one hand on the table. "We've made good progress on implementation this month," he said, clicking through a slide of colored blocks and bullet points. "Training adoption is improving. Dashboard utilization is up. Response lag is down. Frank listened without listening. He knew the cadence by now. The corporate voice. Progress is a thing that could be declared into existence by enough nouns lined up in a room. Line 4 had been running for 6 days on the adjusted sensors. Not enough to trigger anything major, enough to confirm what he had suspected. The dashboard still pushed thermal anomalies down the stack when throughput climbed past a certain point. The line was not failing yet, but it was skimming the edge of the kind of risk Frank had spent decades learning to smell before anyone else believed it was there. Mark clicked to the next slide. A graph appeared, blue and orange. Somebody near the back shifted a chair. The vent overhead rattled once and kept going. Then Mark said, in the light voice of a man trying to sound inclusive, "Frank, since you have been working closest with the floor side of this, why don't you give us a quick update on how the advisory process feels from your end?" Frank looked up at him. The phrasing irritated him immediately. "Feels from your end," as if he were there to provide texture. A few heads turned toward him. Jake looked up from the laptop. Amy folded her hands and sat back, attentive in a way that already felt dangerous. Frank stood. He did not hurry. He had learned long ago that if a man his age moved too quickly in a room full of younger people, they mistook speed for defensiveness. The chair legs scraped softly behind him. Mark gave him an encouraging nod that Frank disliked on sight. Frank said, "I still think there's a flaw in the priority algorithm." The room changed. Not loudly, no gasp, no immediate reaction, just a tightening. Eyes lifting, then shifting. Attention becoming something harder. Mark's face stilled. Jake's mouth twitched. Amy pushed her chair back and stood before Mark had said a word. Frank saw it happen and knew even then, even before she reached the front of the room, that he had handed her exactly what she wanted. Not by being wrong, by saying it in public where she could perform the correction. She took a marker from the tray under the whiteboard and uncapped it with her teeth, then capped it again properly with one hand. Efficient, unbothered, like she had done this version of herself before. "Okay," she said. She drew 3 boxes in a row, connected them with arrows. Her handwriting was small, sharp, almost architectural. "This is the simplified model." Nobody moved. Amy tapped the first box, input. The second, pattern. The third, priority. She turned back toward Frank, marker still in her hand. "What you keep doing," she said, almost pleasantly, "is collapsing the whole system down to one variable because that's what you're used to." Frank stayed on his feet. "I'm talking about one specific failure mode." "Yes." Amy nodded as if indulging a child who had repeated himself. "And I'm saying the system does not rank based on one specific fear." There was a faint sound from somewhere behind Frank, not laughter exactly. A breath pushed out through a nose. He did not turn to see who. He said, "At high throughput, thermal drift doesn't stay local." Amy smiled without warmth. "Right, and that would matter if the system were only looking at thermal drift." Frank's jaw tightened. "It's underweighting speed once the line's already hot," he said. "That's the problem." Amy gave a tiny shake of her head. "No, just that. No explanation attached yet. Just dismissal. Brief enough to sting more than a full sentence would have." She turned back to the board and wrote 2 more words under the boxes, then circled the last one. "The model evaluates relationships," she said. "Not instincts, not floor folklore. Relationships." Frank felt the room around him listening in layers now. Some people listening to the content, maybe. Most listening for the social outcome. Who won the room? Who lost it? That was what meetings became once truth and hierarchy stopped being the same thing. He said, "Then why does thermal priority flatten when speed goes above 70? That made Amy pause. Only for a second, but it was there. Jake looked up more sharply now. Mark spoke for the first time in half a minute. Maybe what Amy's trying to clarify, but Amy lifted one hand, not rudely, but enough to stop him. She looked at Frank with that same patient expression she had worn in training, the one that made patience itself feel like an insult. "Frank," she said, "do you understand what a weighted multivariable model is?" The question sat there in the room. Not innocent, not sincere. Frank said, "I understand when a machine's being trusted too long." Jake let out a short laugh. Tom looked down at his cup. Amy nodded once, like a person confirming a diagnosis. Then she turned back to the board and drew the same 3 boxes again, larger this time. Under the first one, she added a crude little cluster of circles. Under the second, a web of arrows. Under the third, one larger circle with lines radiating from it. "This," she said, tapping the web in the middle, "is integration." She looked over her shoulder at Frank. "Do you get that, or should I make it even simpler?" No one spoke. Frank became aware of the air conditioner vent, the dry marker smell, the stale sweetness of donuts no one had eaten. He could hear the plant through the wall. in faint industrial pulses, belt, lift, release. A world continuing somewhere more honest than this one. He said nothing. Amy faced the room again, not him now, performing for the wider audience, because she knew the moment had ripened enough. Sometimes, she said, if somebody's spent a long time doing something one way, they think that experience substitutes for system understanding. A couple of the younger techs shifted awkwardly. One of them gave a quick, embarrassed half-laugh, and then stopped, as if ashamed of being heard. Frank kept his eyes on Amy. She took a step back from the board, marker loose in her fingers. "Do you understand now?" she asked. Then, with the timing of a line she had already chosen before she stood up, "Or do I need to draw a chicken?" The room went dead. That was the worst part. Not the line itself, the silence after it. Because silence could mean shock, but it could also mean calculation. Men deciding whether speaking would cost them anything. Men deciding that maybe it would. Frank looked around. Tom was staring down into his coffee as if there were something there worth studying. Mark had gone still at the front of the room, both hands flat on the table, face tense in the particular way of a man who knew intervention would define him, and had not chosen whether he could afford it. Jake was smiling openly now, not at Amy, but at the tabletop, giving himself the protection of not quite being seen doing it. The younger workers looked everywhere except at Frank. No one said her name. No one said enough. No one said anything at all. Frank felt something inside him drop away. Not explode, not shatter, just drop. A support beam removed from a structure that had been carrying too much weight already. He pushed his chair back. The sound was sharp on the floor. Amy lowered the marker. Mark said, "Frank," but too late, too soft, and not because he meant stop this. Because he meant don't make this harder. Frank turned and walked to the door. No one followed. No one called him back. The hallway outside was brighter than the room and emptier. He stood there 1 second, maybe 2, with one hand on the cinder block wall, waiting for the blood to settle in his face. His mouth tasted metallic. He could not have said whether he was angry or ashamed or simply stripped. The feelings lay too close together to separate cleanly. He kept walking. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. Down one flight, then another, hands skimming the rail without needing it, shoes striking concrete in a rhythm almost steady enough to borrow. On the floor below, the plant opened around him in its full mechanical indifference. Conveyor noise, compressed air, the low whine of a motor under load, safety yellow railings, grease-darkened concrete. The world had not paused for him. It rarely did. He walked past line 2, past the tool crib, past a pair of techs who both stopped speaking when they saw him coming. One of them nodded too fast. Frank walked by without returning it. At line 4, he stopped and looked at the moving parts. The adjusted sensor was doing exactly what he had made it do. Not enough to fail. Just enough to lean on the model, where it was already weak. A quiet pressure. A question imposed on a system that thought itself smarter than the floor. Frank stared at the readout and saw none of it clearly. After a while, Tom came down the aisle. He slowed as he approached, but he did approach, which in that moment counted for more than courage usually did. He held the empty coffee cup crushed slightly in one hand. Frank kept his eyes on the line. Tom stood beside him, not too close. That was... He stopped and started again. Amy shouldn't have done that. Frank said, "You were in the room." Tom looked at the belt, not at him. "Yeah, that was all." Frank nodded once. Tom shifted his weight. "You heading home?" Frank did not answer. Tom let the silence sit a little, then said, "All right," and walked away. Because there were forms of loyalty that still broke under witness. Frank stayed until the shift ended because he did not know what else to do. He signed off on routine checks. He answered one question from a line lead in a voice that sounded like his own from a distance. He avoided every reflective surface that might confirm how he looked. By the time he drove home, the sky had gone dark over Toledo, without committing to snow. Streetlights turned wet asphalt the color of old coins. His porch light came on late again. He let himself into the house and did not turn on the kitchen light. The refrigerator was enough, a dull white hum and the small glow from the clock above the stove. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The photo of his wife on the fridge door was only partly visible from where he sat. A pale suggestion of her face. One shoulder, the magnet catching a line of light. He did not take off his coat. For a long time, he sat with both hands flat on the table and listened to the house making its ordinary sounds. Refrigerator hum. Pipes ticking once in the wall. A car passing outside. Somewhere, a dog barked and then stopped. He thought about retirement the way a man touches a bruise to see whether it still hurts. Forms. HR. A boxed-up desk that barely counted as a desk. Some polite language about transition. Men downstairs saying, well, it was probably time. A daughter in Chicago telling him this was for the best in the voice people used when they wanted the best to sound like relief. The plant needs people there, he had once said. What he had not said was the other half of it, that he needed the plant in return, that without it, the shape of his days became something he did not know how to live inside. He put one hand over his eyes. At first he thought he was just tired. Then his throat tightened once, unexpectedly, in a way that felt almost like choking. He lowered his hand and stared into the dark kitchen as if the room itself had changed and he had missed when. He had not cried when his wife died. Not at the hospital, not in the funeral home. Not when the relatives left and the casseroles ran out and the house went still in the permanent way. He had done what needed doing, signed what needed signing, put on decent clothes and answered questions and accepted food from people he would later forget. Now, in his own kitchen, after a woman young enough to be his daughter had asked if she needed to draw him a chicken in front of 20 people, something gave way where grief had not managed it. He bowed his head. No sound at first, just breath not behaving. His face hot, then colder, his hand finding the edge of the table and staying there. He did not sob. It was uglier than that and quieter. His shoulders moving once, twice against his own permission. Water hitting the backs of his fingers before he fully registered where it had come from. He stayed like that until it passed because there was nothing else to do. When he finally lifted his head, the kitchen was unchanged. The clock still glowed. The refrigerator still hummed. The photo still held its place on the door. A knock came at the front door. Frank sat still, not moving toward it. Another knock. Then Tom's voice, muffled through the house. "Frank, it's me." Frank wiped his face with both hands, stood slowly, and went to the door. Tom came in carrying cold air with him. He looked awkward the moment he crossed the threshold, as if houses made him uncomfortable, unless there was a game on or a repair to help with. He took off his cap and held it in both hands. Frank said, "What?" Tom looked at him properly then, and some part of his expression changed. "You all right?" Frank gave a short, humorless breath that wasn't a laugh. "You drove over here to ask that." Tom shut the door behind him. "I drove over here because you left and I didn't like the look of you." Frank turned and walked back into the kitchen. Tom followed after a second. The room was still dark except for the stove clock and the refrigerator light leaking around the seal. Tom stopped near the table. "Why is it dark in here?" Frank sat down again. Didn't feel like light. Tom stood there with the cap in his hand. "You got anything to drink?" "In the fridge." Tom opened it, took out 2 beers, handed one across, and sat without asking. The chair complained under him. He set the bottle on the table, unopened. For a while, neither man said anything. Then Tom said, "She crossed a line." Frank looked at the bottle in front of him. Everybody watched. Tom rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cap. "Yeah." Nobody said anything. Tom nodded once. Frank leaned back, staring past him at the dim shape of the kitchen counter. "I keep thinking maybe that's the answer." Tom looked over him. "What is?" "That I'm done." Tom said nothing. Frank swallowed, then said it because not saying it was harder now. "Maybe I am too old for this." Tom's head came up sharply. "No." Frank gave the smallest shrug. "You saw me in there." "I saw them in there." Frank turned the bottle once on the table but did not open it. "I don't know anymore." Tom sat with that. He was not quick with words on a good day, and this wasn't one. He looked at the fridge, at the floor, at his own hands. When he finally spoke, it came out plain and a little rough. "You're not old," he paused. "Well, you are old." In spite of everything, Frank let out the faintest sound of a laugh. Tom went on, "That ain't the point. The point is they're stupid in a very expensive way." Frank looked at him. Tom cracked the beer open but still didn't drink. "They don't listen to how things break. They listen to screens. Fine, that's where we are." Frank said, So if you're right, you're not going to beat them with chalk on the floor and arguments and meetings." Frank looked back at the bottle. Tom leaned forward slightly. "You need to prove it in the language they understand." The sentence sat there. Frank did not answer immediately. But something in him, buried under the humiliation, under the exhaustion, under the thought of retirement, like a closed door he could not yet touch, shifted and lifted its head. Tom saw it. He said, quieter now, "Tell me what you've done." Frank looked at him. For a second, he considered lying, saying nothing, protecting the last private part of what had become his own campaign against irrelevance and contempt. Instead, he said, "I adjusted 3 spare sensors." Tom's face did not change much, but it changed enough. "On the line?" "Rotated 1 in, 2 ready." "What kind of adjusted?" "Enough." Tom let that sit. "Oh, Jesus." Frank took the beer and opened it. Too late for that. Tom stared at the tabletop for a while, then said, "Can you isolate 4?" Frank looked up. Tom met his eyes now, directly, without the usual sidestep. "For a short window, 2 weeks maybe. I can move checks around. Keep people off it unless there's a reason." Frank said nothing. Tom went on, slower now because he was hearing himself commit. "Not forever, not clean, but I can give you room." The kitchen seemed different suddenly. Not warmer, not better, just occupied by something that had not been there an hour ago. Frank asked, "Why?" Tom gave him a tired look. "'Cause I was in that room too." Frank held his gaze. Tom took his first drink of beer. "And because if they're gonna treat you like that, I'd at least like them to be wrong." Silence again. Then Frank said, "If this goes bad," "It's already bad." "They'll look at you." Tom nodded, "Probably." Frank looked down at his hands, then at the bottle, then toward the fridge where his wife's photo hung in the low kitchen light. Watching nothing, offering nothing, still there anyway. Finally, he said, 2 weeks. Tom set the bottle down. "You help me isolate line 4, Frank said. "I'll let the whole happen." Tom's jaw tightened once. Not in fear exactly, in acceptance. Then he held out his hand across the table. Frank looked at it. Tom said, "I'll cover you if they start asking." Frank stared at the hand a second longer, then took it. Tom's grip was dry, firm, familiar from 30 years of shift starts and bad repairs and funerals and snow days and all the other ordinary events that made a life look smaller than it was. Frank said, "You don't need to." Tom frowned. "What?" Frank let go and leaned back. "I've got nothing left to lose." Tom looked at him for a long second, as if he wanted to argue and could not find a shape for it that would not break apart in the room. In the end, he only nodded. Outside, a car passed on the wet street. Inside, the refrigerator hummed on. The beers sweated on the table between them. And in the dark kitchen of a modest house in Toledo, 2 men sat with the plan now spoken aloud, no longer something one of them could still pretend he had not chosen. The last hand. Frank knocked on Mark's office door after 6, when most of the upstairs lights had already gone from office bright to after-hours tired. Mark looked up from his desk, surprised enough not to hide it. For a second, he seemed to think Frank might have come to say something reckless in the wake of the meeting the week before, something loud enough to force a consequence. Instead, Frank stood in the doorway with his coat still on, one hand at his side, the other holding nothing. "Got a minute," Frank said. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, sure." Frank stepped in and closed the door behind him. The office felt smaller with the blinds half drawn. Outside the glass wall, the hallway lights gave off a flat yellow white, and the plant beyond that was mostly sound now, distant conveyor rhythm. A forklift alarm somewhere far below, the faint metal cough of a machine cycling down. Mark's desk lamp was the only warm light in the room. It hit the edge of the desk, the legal pad, the stainless steel watch on Mark's wrist. Mark gestured toward the chair across from him. "You want to sit?" Frank didn't. Mark stayed seated a second, then seemed to decide sitting would make the room worse. He stood too. "What's going on?" he asked. Frank looked at the whiteboard mounted on the side wall. A few ghost lines from old diagrams still showed through the cleaning fluid if the light hit them right. He crossed to it, took a marker from the tray and uncapped it. Mark watched him. Frank drew a line first, then 3 boxes, then a second line running beneath the first. Not Amy's boxes, not those insulting little cartoons of process. Frank drew the floor the way he understood it. Sensor input, temperature variance, speed, line load, the point where risk ought to climb, and the point where the dashboard still treated it like a thing that could wait. "This," Frank said, tapping the upper line, "is what your people think the model's doing." Mark folded his arms. "Okay." Frank tapped the lower line. "This is what it's doing when throughput gets high and thermal starts drifting at the same time." Mark didn't interrupt. Frank drew another arrow, sharper now. "It smooths the wrong variable. Treats the rise like noise because line speed's already in the pattern. That's backwards." Mark stepped closer. Frank kept talking, not because he wanted to persuade Mark with language, but because stopping would give Mark room to put management between them. At lower throughput, maybe the system gets away with it. At higher throughput, it doesn't. Parts move too fast. If the sensor starts going soft, the model still sits there, wanting more confidence while the line keeps making garbage. Mark looked at the board, at the points Frank had marked where the weighting should have shifted and didn't. Frank added one more circle near the end and boxed it hard. "That's where the lot gets touched." Mark's face stayed still, but his eyes changed. Not belief exactly, recognition. The kind of person tried not to show until he knew whether showing it would cost him. "How sure are you?" he asked. Frank put the cap back on the marker, then took it off again and added a smaller notation beside the last box. "Sure enough, I came up here after hours." That's not an answer. Frank turned. You want a percentage? Mark didn't smile. I want to know whether you're asking me to put my name on something real. Frank looked at him for a moment. There were things he could have said then, about 35 years on the floor, about knowing how machines lied in winter, about watching Amy and Jake turn software into religion because neither one of them had ever had to hear a line go wrong before dawn and understand from sound alone how much money was burning. Instead, he said, I adjusted the conditions. Mark's gaze lifted from the board to Frank's face. What does that mean? Frank didn't answer immediately. Mark's mouth tightened. Frank, I said I adjusted the conditions. How? Frank looked at the whiteboard instead of at him, enough to make the weakness show if it's there. The room went quiet. Down below, a conveyor started again, then steadied into its usual pulse. Mark walked to the desk, then back again, hands on his hips now. He had the look of a man trying to sort risk into piles and discovering all the piles led to his own name. You altered production hardware? Frank said nothing. Mark gave a short, disbelieving breath. Jesus Christ. You asked for hard proof. I didn't ask you to sabotage the line. Frank looked at him then. You didn't ask me anything. You told me nobody would listen unless I made them. Mark took that without answering. Frank went back to the board and tapped the point where the failure curve bent. It's contained, small enough. If I'm right, it'll show in the ranking before it spreads far. If I'm wrong, you can write me up and send me home. Mark stared at the diagram for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its office polish. Amy and Jake won't accept this from a theory. I know. They won't accept it from your notes either. I know. And if I step in now and overrule them without something concrete, they go to Detroit. They say I let a legacy engineer derail rollout because he doesn't like the new system. Frank gave the smallest shrug. Then don't overrule them. Mark looked at him sharply. That's easy for you to say. Is it? Mark rubbed a hand over his face and stared at the board. No, he said quietly. No, it isn't. Another silence. Then Mark said, if this is going to happen, it has to happen small. Frank did not move. Mark went on, thinking as he spoke now, reluctant but already inside the logic. A contained run. Enough throughput to trigger the waiting problem. Not enough exposure to ruin a full lot. Frank listened. Line 4, Mark said. It's already where you've been watching. Frank gave a single nod. Mark looked at him. Can you keep it there? Yes. That's not what I asked. Mark's voice sharpened. Can you keep it from becoming a disaster? Frank's face did not change. If Tom helps. Mark's eyes flicked once, involuntarily, toward the door. Tom knows? He knows enough. Mark let out a breath through his nose. Great. He went to the window, looked through the blinds into the dark hallway, then came back. The movement made him seem younger for a second. Not in age, but in the uncertainty of it. A man who had been taught decisions were made in clean rooms with slides and sign-off chains, now discovering how ugly a real one looked. Finally, he said, if you do this and somebody catches the hardware change before the fault exposes the waiting issue, I can't protect you. Frank stood with the capped marker in his hand, listening. Mark held his gaze now, forcing the terms to stay plain. I mean that. I won't be able to save your job. I may not be able to save mine. Frank said, you think I came in here looking for safety? Mark didn't answer. Frank set the marker back in the tray with more care than necessary. If it works. Mark's face closed slightly. What? If it works, Frank said. You don't get to act surprised in the room and then wash your hands of it after. Mark said nothing. Frank took a step closer. If I'm right, you say it out loud. Mark looked at him for a long time. Then, carefully, I'll say what the data says. Frank's expression did not change, but something in him hardened another degree. Not because the answer surprised him, because it didn't. That all you got? It's what I can give you. Frank nodded once. Mark added, quieter now. I'm here after hours with the door closed, listening to this. That's more than I was giving you a week ago. Frank looked at him. That was true, also not enough. Both things could exist in the same room. He had lived long enough to know that. After a while, he said, fine. Mark glanced back at the board. What do you need? Line 4 left alone for a short window. No extra checks, no AI team crawling over it because they got bored. Mark gave a humorless breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. You make it sound easy. It isn't. How long? 2 weeks. That's too long. It's what I said. Mark considered. 10 days. Frank shook his head. 12. No. Mark looked toward the ceiling for half a second, then back at Frank. 13. Frank waited just long enough to make the number feel expensive. 2 weeks, he said. Mark's jaw shifted. He hated losing ground inch by inch. Frank could see that. But he also understood now that he'd already crossed too far into this to pretend he could return to innocence by winning a negotiation. 14 days, Mark said at last. No more. Frank nodded. Mark pointed at the board. And it stays small. If the model's as good as Amy says, it won't spread far. Mark gave him a look. Don't do that. Do what? Turn this into punishment. Frank didn't answer. The fact that Mark said it at all told him more than if the younger man had kept quiet. Mark went back to the desk and sat, suddenly tired. He opened the legal pad, then closed it without writing anything. I'll shift some review traffic off line 4. Quietly. Frank waited. That's all I can do, Mark said. Frank looked at him a second longer, then turned toward the door. Behind him, Mark said, Frank. He stopped but did not turn around. If you're wrong, Frank stood there, hand on the doorknob. I know, he said. Then he left. The floor was mostly empty by the time he got back down there. Night crew not yet fully in, day shift almost gone. The plant had that in-between feeling it got after hours, when the machinery seemed bigger because there were fewer people around to make scale out of human noise. Safety yellow rails under the fluorescent strips. Concrete holding the day's cold. A maintenance cart parked crooked near the tool crib. Tom was waiting by line 4, leaning against the cabinet with both hands in his jacket pockets. He straightened when he saw Frank. Well, Frank came to a stop beside him and looked down the line before answering. The adjusted sensor sat where it belonged, ordinary to the eye. The panel lights blinked through their sequence. He's in, Tom blinked. He what? He'll give us room. Tom stared at him a moment. That's not the same thing as being in. No, Tom exhaled through his nose. Figures. Frank put a hand on the cabinet edge. The metal was cool under his palm. 14 days. Tom looked down the line, then back. He know what you already changed? Frank didn't answer. Tom shook his head once. I don't know why I asked. A forklift moved slowly at the far end of the aisle, blue light rotating against the wall. Somewhere above them, a ventilation fan kicked on with a heavy cough. Tom said, What's the plan? Frank opened the panel and looked inside. Wiring harnesses, connector seats, the familiar narrow order of things. Here, at least, logic still had screws. We isolate the checks, he said. Reduce eyes on 4 unless something forces a call. Tom nodded. I can move Mitchell to 6 for most of next week. He's the nosy one. Do it. And the AI kids? Frank looked at the sensor bank. They'll stay busy if the dashboard tells them things are fine. Tom followed his gaze until it doesn't. Frank shut the panel gently. That's the idea. Tom pulled his hands out of his pockets and stepped closer, lowering his voice, though no one was near. I can hold people off for a while, not forever. If Amy decides she wants a live check on 4, I can't physically tackle her. Frank glanced at him. Would pay to see it. Tom gave a short smile that disappeared almost immediately. Yeah. They started down the line together, stopping at each station not because they needed to, but because walking it gave the conversation someplace to live besides their faces. A housing here. A readout there. Frank touched bolts, checked brackets, adjusted nothing. Tom kept pace beside him, glancing over his shoulder from time to time the way men did when they were talking too close to trouble. At the thermal regulation point, Frank stopped. This one stays, he said, touching the sensor already in place. Tom looked at it as if he could see the alteration hidden in the casing. And the others? Ready. You swapping them in too? Frank considered. Maybe one. Depends what we see first week. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. You ever think maybe there was an easier hobby? Frank did not answer, and Tom's face changed slightly, the joke falling away under its own weight. Sorry, Tom muttered. Frank stood with one hand on the line. He was thinking about the office upstairs. Mark by the whiteboard, already halfway inside the truth but still bargaining with it. He was thinking about Amy in the meeting room, smiling with the marker in her hand. He was thinking, though he would not name it cleanly even to himself, of how much of this had stopped being about the plant alone somewhere between the meme and the chicken. Tom said, You sure this is what you want? Frank looked at him. That was the wrong question. Not because it was unfair, because wanting had become less useful than momentum. He said, This is what's left. Tom held his eyes a second, then nodded once. They worked another hour after that, not altering the main line yet, but preparing it for being left alone. Tom changed check assignments in the maintenance board downstairs. Frank relabeled 2 routine inspection notes so they would draw attention elsewhere first if staffing got thin. Small things, administrative things. The kind of quiet handling that looked like ordinary plant life until it didn't. By the time they were done, the fluorescent lights had dimmed automatically in the outer aisles. The plant sounded farther away, emptier, more like a ship than a building. Tom stood near the main control panel on line 4 with his hands on his hips, looking at the switches. You still got time to walk this back, he said. Frank came up beside him. The panel's indicator lights reflected dull green in the scratched plastic cover. Beneath the housing, vibration ran through the frame in a low, steady hum. The machine was waiting to be told it was only a machine. "Do I?" Frank said. Tom glanced at him, then away again. "No, probably not." He stepped back from the panel and nodded toward it. "Your hand." Frank looked down. The switch was ordinary, a guarded industrial toggle among a row of others, no bigger than a man's thumb, worn slightly on the edge from years of use. He had flipped versions of it thousands of times in his life. The gesture itself meant nothing. The moment attached to it did. Tom said, "You sure?" Frank put his hand on the panel. Metal, cool, familiar. He could feel the faint vibration through the housing, the pulse of the line waiting to resume its full logic. 14 days, no safety net. Mark upstairs with his conditional belief and his lawyer's version of courage. Tom beside him, frightened enough to matter and still standing there. Frank said, "Never been surer." He lifted the guard and flipped the switch. The line answered at once. A relay clicked. The belt started. The motor caught and settled into load. Down the run, indicator lights came alive in sequence, one after another, the system waking into exactly the conditions it had been taught to trust. Frank kept his hand on the panel for 1 second longer, feeling the machine take the decision and convert it into motion. Then he let go. Beside him, Tom watched the line run and said nothing. Neither did Frank. There was nothing left to say that would make the next 14 days less real. The system was live now. The weakness had room to breathe, and all the arguments, all the meetings, all the humiliations that had brought him to this place had narrowed into the simplest possible test. Whether the machine would finally tell the truth in a language they could not laugh off, the line of code. The lot started going bad on a Thursday just after 9 in the morning. Not all at once. Nothing in a factory ever failed with the clean theatricality people imagine from outside. It started as a discrepancy too small to justify panic. Heat variation showing up in finished parts from line 4. A handful of pieces drifting out of tolerance in a way that looked, at first glance, like ordinary noise. A tech flagged the first tray, then a second. Then the quality lead came down, checked the readings, and stopped smiling. 22, the line was still running, and that was the first real sign something had gone wrong. Frank was at the far end of the floor near the old parts cage when he heard the change in the noise around line 4. Not the machine noise, the human noise. Voices narrowing, footsteps quickening. A forklift forced to stop in the aisle while 2 supervisors crossed in front of it without looking. He set down the clipboard he'd been holding and turned before anyone called him. The plant had a way of gathering itself around trouble. Men appeared from other stations with the pretense of errands. A quality cart rolled in. Somebody from inventory stood too long with a barcode gun in his hand, not scanning anything. Amy was already there. She stood at the dashboard station with one hand on the keyboard and the other pressed flat against the edge of the console, eyes moving too fast across the screen. Jake was beside her, laptop open, cable running from his machine into the main port. Mark stood a few feet back, not speaking, coat still on, as if he had been pulled from somewhere else and had not had time to settle into management posture. Tom was at the near side of the line, not in the middle of it, not drawing attention to himself, just present enough. A tray of finished parts sat under the inspection light. 3 pieces had already been pulled and marked. Another 4 were waiting. Frank walked toward them without hurrying. Nobody stopped him. Nobody invited him either. Amy said, "That doesn't make sense," to the screen, not to anyone in the room. Jake was already answering. "The thermal feed is clean." "It can't be clean." "It is." Amy clicked through another panel, jaw tight now. "Check the upstream sensor cluster." "I did." "Check it again." Jake's fingers moved fast over his keyboard. He had lost the loose, amused expression he usually wore. His face looked younger without it. Not kinder, just less protected. Frank stopped beside the tray and looked down at the bad parts. The flaw was subtle but unmistakable once you knew where to look. Heat distortion beginning at the margin. Not catastrophic yet. Enough to spoil the batch. Enough to keep spoiling it if the line kept trusting the wrong logic. He lifted one piece, turned it under the inspection light, and set it back down. Amy glanced at him once, then back to the dashboard. "No critical anomaly," she said, almost to herself. "It's still ranking thermal as secondary." Jake said, "Because the model isn't seeing a primary thermal event." Frank looked at the monitor over Amy's shoulder. Throughput was above 70, just above. Enough. The priority rank was still lower than it should have been. The system had flagged variance, yes, but not with the urgency the line required. It was still smoothing the thermal shift under the speed pattern, reading the rise as behavior inside tolerance rather than danger, accelerated by volume. Amy opened another log and said, "Code path. Looks fine." Jake said, "I told you, it was tested." Mark stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the screen and not speaking. Frank could feel him holding still inside his own knowledge, waiting for the moment when silence would stop being possible. A younger engineer stepped up beside Amy and said, "We've got estimated exposure at 50 grand if we stop it here." Amy snapped, "Then stop talking and help me." The engineer moved back at once. Frank kept his eyes on the numbers. The line was still running. Tom caught his eye once across the aisle, then looked away. Jake muttered, "It shouldn't be possible." Amy said, "Unless the sensor's dirty." Frank said quietly, "It isn't." Nobody answered right away. Then Amy turned. The room had filled more while they were all pretending it hadn't. A few line leads, 2 quality people, one of the younger maintenance techs from training, everyone holding themselves at that exact distance where witnessing became deniable. Amy looked at Frank like she had nearly forgotten he was in the building. "What?" Frank did not answer her. He stepped toward the console instead. Jake moved slightly in front of it. Not enough to make a scene. Enough to mark possession. Frank looked at him. Jake stepped aside. Frank set one hand on the edge of the station and scanned the open log. Amy had the code view collapsed to summary layers. He knew enough now to know what he needed wasn't on the first screen. "Expand it," he said. Amy didn't move. Frank looked at the monitor, not at her. "Expand the waiting logic." Jake said too quickly, "That's not the issue." Frank said, "Then open it." Amy and Jake both stayed still. Mark spoke at last. "Open it." No one moved for one beat more. Then Jake clicked into the deeper view. The screen changed. More text, more structure, nested logic. Abbreviated variable names, waiting branches, threshold condition. Frank leaned in slightly. The font was too small, the screen glare too cold, but the line was there, or near enough to what he had been tracing in his head for weeks. Not one single sentence of doom. Something worse and more ordinary. Conditional logic, written by people who trusted the elegance of the pattern more than the brutality of the floor. He pointed. "Here." Nobody spoke. Jake frowned. "That's throughput normalization." Frank kept his finger near the line without touching the screen. "No. That's where you let it bury thermal escalation once the line gets past 70. Amy came closer. Frank moved one line lower. "There." Jake said, "That's not ignoring thermal. It is when speed clears the threshold and your model treats the heat rise as part of stabilized output variation." Amy leaned toward the screen, her shoulder almost against his now. Frank could feel the exact second she saw it. Not as a revelation, not as a full confession, but as a fracture inside certainty. Her face changed. Only a little, but enough. Jake said no. Frank didn't look at him. He pointed again, steady now. "I told you in the first week. Once throughput gets high, temperature stops being a side variable. It becomes the thing that makes the rest expensive." Amy was reading quickly now, scrolling half a page, then back again. The room had gone so quiet Frank could hear the line itself still running beyond them, unaware that its small disaster had finally become legible. Jake said, louder this time, "That can't be what's causing this." Frank turned his head just enough to look at him. "Why?" "Because it was tested." Frank said, "Not here." That landed. Jake looked down. Amy stayed on the code, one hand lifted to her mouth now, not in shame exactly, but in concentration, pushed beyond comfort. She clicked into the linked model output, ran a quick simulation, changed one threshold, ran it again. The priority rank jumped. No one in the room missed it. A quality lead near the back said very softly, "Jesus." Amy straightened. The color had gone out of her face. Mark stepped forward then. Not hurried, not triumphant. But he moved into the center of the silence and made it official by occupying it. "Stop the line," he said. Tom was already moving before the sentence finished. He hit the shutdown sequence. The conveyor slowed, hesitated, then settled into mechanical stillness, leaving the bad lot where it was. The sudden quiet after the running stopped made the whole floor feel exposed. Mark looked at Frank. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The words were there. Frank could see that. But Mark was arranging them into the form he could live with. Then he said, "Thank you, Frank." Not warm, not private, public, heard by everyone standing there. Frank said nothing. Jake took one step back from the console and kept going until he hit the edge of the table behind him. Amy was still staring at the screen, one hand braced against the station now as though the floor had shifted under her. Then sharply, almost as if she needed noise to protect herself from the silence, she said, "But he interfered." No one answered. Amy turned toward Mark. "He did? He had to. This doesn't just happen on its own." Her eyes flicked once to Frank, then away again. He let it happen. Mark looked at her. The plant was listening now. Not just the people immediately around the console, the ones standing farther out too. Men pretending to check clipboards. Women from quality not bothering to pretend anything anymore. The room inside the floor had widened. Amy said, "We need to look at the hardware. If he altered the sensor input, then Mark cut in. And if he hadn't, Amy stopped. Mark didn't raise his voice. That made everyone lean in more. If he hadn't, Mark said, we would still be running this line under a flaw none of us caught. Amy opened her mouth. Mark went on, still even, still controlled. This batch cost us $50,000. A full production run under the same logic could have cost us $2 million and put 50 jobs in the ground by quarter's end. Nobody moved. Mark looked at her with a steadiness Frank had not seen from him before. So if your next sentence is about procedure, I want you to finish it all the way. Amy said nothing. Jake looked at the floor. Mark turned to the quality lead. Contain the lot. Full review of line 4 output for the last 72 hours. I want a hard exposure number before lunch. The lead nodded and moved at once. Mark looked at Amy and Jake. My office, 20 minutes. Then to Franca, you too. Frank followed Mark upstairs after the floor had broken apart into motion again. Not quickly, nothing in him felt quick. That was the first strange part of the victory, if victory was the word for it. He had imagined this moment in pieces over the last weeks. Amy caught in public, Jake with nowhere to put his grin, Mark forced to say the words. And now that it had happened, or enough of it had happened, he felt mostly tired. Not disappointed. Not satisfied. Just emptied out by the arrival of something he had been carrying too long. Mark's office looked the same as it always had. Desk, legal pads, certificates, the whiteboard where Frank had first drawn the real version of the flaw. But the air in it had changed. Amy stood by the window with her arms crossed hard across her body. Jake stayed near the chair and kept his eyes lowered. Frank remained by the door until Mark told him to sit. Tom did not come up. This part was not for him. Mark closed the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Amy said, he set the conditions. Mark looked at her. Yes. That matters? It does. Amy waited. Mark did not rescue her with more. Jake tried next. We still don't know exactly what he changed. Frank said, enough. Jake's face tightened, but he did not answer. Mark sat down, but he didn't lean back. Here's where we are. There was a flaw in the weighting logic. Frank identified it weeks ago. The flaw was dismissed. Today, it produced measurable loss on a contained line before it could become a plant-wide event. Amy said, contained by him. Mark looked at her again, and something in his expression had gone past avoidance now into decision. Yes, by him. The room stayed still. Amy lowered her arms. That doesn't make it okay. Mark's voice remained calm. No, it makes it complicated. Jake gave a small, incredulous breath. Complicated. Mark turned to him. Do you want a different word? Jake looked away. Frank sat with both hands on his knees. He was aware of the coat on his shoulders, still smelling faintly of machine oil and cold air from the floor. He was aware of Amy's silence, of Jake shrinking inside his own body, of Mark speaking like a man who had finally stepped onto one side of a line and was not yet comfortable there. Mark looked at Frank. I'm going to address the floor this afternoon. Frank did not answer. I'm going to say you were right. Amy's head came up. Mark, he cut across her. Yes. Amy stared at him. You can't. Watch me. That, more than the content, changed the room. Amy said, quieter now, but more dangerous for it. He doesn't understand the system. Mark said, apparently he understood it better than you did. Color rose back into her face, sharp this time. Jake still said nothing. Mark went on. There will be formal write-ups for the post, the recording, and the conduct around all of this. HR can decide how they want to phrase it. I'm not interested in the phrasing. Amy looked stunned by that in a way the technical failure alone had not achieved. Public error, she might have recovered from. Administrative consequence was harder. It entered the record. Then Mark looked back at Frank. He did not soften when he spoke, which Frank respected more than softness. I want you in technical ops. Frank frowned. What? Mark rested both forearms on the desk. Lead role, 2 years. Veto authority on any system change affecting floor operations until we rebuild this correctly. Amy gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You're kidding. No, she doesn't know what that means, Frank said before he could stop himself. Amy turned toward him, but Mark answered first. I know exactly what it means. Amy said, he doesn't know AI. Mark looked at her. He knows the plant. She stared at him. Mark's voice stayed level. That's worth more here than every polished deck and MIT credential you brought through the door. No one spoke after that. The office held the silence in 4 separate ways. Amy furious and humiliated. Jake reduced to a quiet outline of himself. Mark breathing harder than he wanted anyone to notice. Frank sitting in the chair, feeling the offer land somewhere outside him first, as if it had been made to a man with his name, but not yet his body. Finally, Frank said, "I'm not taking an office." Mark blinked once, thrown. "I didn't say you had to." "Good." Mark almost smiled. "Almost. We'll work out the details." Amy looked from one of them to the other as if the conversation had slipped into a language she disliked on principle. Mark stood. 3 o'clock, floor meeting. He looked at Amy and Jake. "Be there." The meeting took place near the center aisle, where the floor opened widest. Workers gathered in loose rows between railings and tool carts and parked pallet jacks. Not everyone. A plant never fully stopped for anything short of fire or death. But enough. 50, maybe 60 people. More than enough for public memory. Frank stood off to one side at first, wanting distance from the thing even as it happened. Tom came and stayed near him without comment. His face gave away little, but Frank saw the alertness in it. Amy stood with Jake several feet away, neither of them speaking. Mark climbed onto the low-maintenance platform by the railing so people could see him. No monitor, no slides. Just him in shirt sleeves under the fluorescent lights. Factory noise dimmed but never gone. He looked over the group and waited until the talking died. "Line 4 had a controlled failure event this morning," he said. "We contained it quickly. Exposure appears limited to about $50,000. A low murmur moved through the group, then quieted. Mark continued. "The important part is why it happened." He looked once toward Frank, not long, just enough. Frank raised concerns about the weighting logic in the new priority system in the first week of implementation. Those concerns were not taken seriously. He was right. The sentence moved through the plant like a current. Frank felt it more than heard it. Heads turning, bodies shifting. A man in the second row folding his arms tighter. One of the younger maintenance techs glancing at the floor. Mark did not rush the next part. "We were wrong," he said. "And not just wrong technically." The quiet deepened. "We handled him badly. Some of that is on specific people. Some of that is on me." Tom looked sideways at Frank then, brief and unreadable. Mark went on, "Amy and Jake will both receive formal disciplinary reports. That process is already moving." Nobody looked at Amy now. That was its own form of looking. Then Mark said, "And Frank, He paused, either for effect or because the words still felt new in his own mouth. "I've asked him to take a lead role in technical operations, with veto authority over any system change affecting the floor for the next 2 years. This time the murmur was louder. Amy spoke before she meant to or before she could stop herself. "He doesn't know AI." The room turned toward her. Mark didn't. He kept his eyes on the workers as he answered. "He doesn't need to know AI." Only then did he look at her. "He knows the factory," he said. "That matters more." Nothing dramatic followed. No applause, no cinematic redemption. This was a plant, not a church revival. People shifted their weight, looked at Frank, looked away. Some of them nodded once. A few of the older workers didn't move at all, but something in their faces had gone less guarded. The meeting broke apart slowly. Tom stayed beside Frank until the aisle had thinned. "Well," he said. Frank watched Mark step down from the platform. Amy was already gone. Jake still stood where he had been, looking like a man calculating exit routes no one had yet asked him to use. "Well, what?" Tom gave a short breath that could have been a laugh. "You were waiting your whole life to hear that kid say you were right." Frank looked out across the floor. Line 4 sat still under inspection lights, its small exposed wound now part of plant history. Maybe he had been waiting. Maybe that was the part he still didn't want to touch directly. He said, "I was waiting for them to stop acting stupid." Tom smiled once, tiredly, and same thing, mostly. Late that afternoon, when the noise had returned to normal and the shock had dispersed into paperwork and contained gossip and people telling the story differently at each repetition, Frank stepped outside through the side door near shipping. The air hit him colder than he expected. The sign over the entrance looked older from outside than from within. The company name faded slightly at the edges, the metal brackets streaked by years of weather off Lake Erie. Trucks idled farther down the lot. Gray clouds sat low over Toledo like another roof. Frank stood there with his coat buttoned and his hands empty. He had won, if this counted as winning. The flaw had shown itself. Amy had gone white in front of the code. Mark had said the words in public. The offer had been made. The balance in the building had shifted, maybe not forever, but enough to matter. And inside him there was less triumph than he had expected. Less heat. Mostly a kind of spare quiet. As though the weeks of humiliation and planning and anger had all been holding up a moment that, once it arrived, had nothing underneath it except fatigue. Tom came out and stood beside him. For a while, they looked at the building instead of at each other. Tom said, "You did it." Frank kept his eyes on the sign. After a second, he said, "I just want to go home." Tom nodded once. Neither man moved right away. The factory behind them kept humming through the walls, alive and ordinary, and changed all at once, while the evening gathered over the parking lot and made everything look briefly, from a distance, almost clean. The kids who learned. Mark was halfway through his first apology before Frank decided he meant it. The bar was narrow and dim and too warm near the front windows. Browns and amber light. A television over the bottles showing a game neither of them was watching. The place smelled like fryer oil, beer foam, and old wood that had absorbed 30 years of winter coats. Outside, Toledo had gone dark early, the street wet from sleet that had started and stopped without committing. Mark sat across from him in shirt sleeves, jacket folded over the back of the chair, one hand around a glass he kept lifting and setting down without drinking much from it. "I should have stopped it sooner," he said. Frank looked at the beer in front of him. Condensation had already run in a ring onto the napkin. "Probably." Mark gave a short breath through his nose. "That's generous." "It ain't generous." Mark nodded once, took the hit, and went on. "I'm not talking about the code now. I mean before that. The meetings, the training, Jake with the video, Amy in that room." He glanced up, then away again. "I kept telling myself I was managing personalities." Frank took a swallow of beer. Across the room, somebody laughed too loud at something that wasn't funny enough to earn it. A waitress carried a tray of wings past the bar, moving like a person who'd done it so long she no longer felt the weight. Mark said, "I let it go because they were useful." Frank looked at him then. Mark didn't flinch. That's the truth of it. For a second, neither man said anything. Frank had imagined this conversation in some version during the worst of it. Imagined what Mark might say once the facts had cornered him and the plant had shifted and everyone could pretend public correction had always been inevitable. He had thought the apology, if it came, would feel cleaner. It didn't. Real apologies rarely did. They arrived with the late smell of them. Frank said, "Technology's a tool." Mark waited. Frank rolled the bottle once between his palm and the table. "A wrench is a tool. A sensor's a tool. Code's a tool. Anybody who starts worshiping the tool instead of the job it's for is asking to get bit." Mark let out the beginning of a smile, then stopped it, not because the line was too polished, but because he knew enough now to hear the warning still inside it. He lifted his glass. "To old men who won't die." Frank looked at him a second, then gave the faintest crooked smile. He touched his beer bottle lightly against Mark's glass. "To kids who can still learn." They drank. The beer tasted colder than the room. For a while, they let the bar take over the conversation. The game on television, two men arguing by the dartboard about snow tires. The bartender wiping down the same patch of wood twice because there was nothing else immediate to do. 6 months had passed since line 4. Enough time for the plant to harden around the new version of the story and sand down some of the uglier edges. Not enough time for Frank to forget any of them. Mark said, "Jake left 2 weeks after the write-up." "I heard. He said the place had gotten toxic." Frank gave him a look. Mark almost laughed. "Yeah." Frank took another drink. "He's in Columbus now," Mark said. "Some logistics startup." "That'll go well." Mark smiled properly at that one, then let it fade. Amy stayed. Frank's eyes moved back to his beer. "Not barely," Mark added. "First month, I thought she was going to quit every Wednesday. She thought I was going to fire her every Thursday." Mark looked at him over the rim of his glass. "You enjoyed that?" Frank didn't answer. That answer was enough. The first lesson had started 3 days after Mark made the offer official. Amy came into the old training room at 7 in the morning carrying a notebook she clearly resented having bought. Her jaw was set. Her hair was pulled back too tightly. She stood by the door instead of sitting. Frank had already been there 10 minutes, not because he was eager, but because he liked rooms before other people arrived in them. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A stale smell of dry erase marker hung under the coffee he'd brought up in a battered thermos. On the table, he had laid out a disassembled temperature sensor, a bracket, 2 connector housings, and a set of small tools. Amy looked at the table, then at him. "This is stupid," she said. Frank sat in the chair nearest the windowless wall and unscrewed the cap on his thermos. "Sit down. I don't need mechanical basics. You do if you want to keep making decisions on the floor." Amy stayed standing. Frank poured coffee into the lid cup. Steam rose between them. She said, "This is punishment." Frank looked at the sensor on the table. "No, punishment would be me letting you stay ignorant." Amy's mouth tightened. He nodded once toward the chair. "Sit." For a second, he thought she might walk out. The thought didn't alarm him. It irritated him a little, but only a little. If she walked, that would tell him something too. Instead, she pulled the chair back with more force than necessary and sat. Frank slid the sensor toward her. "Take it apart." She didn't touch it. I know what it does. That's not what I said. Amy stared at the parts laid out before her as if they belonged to a lesser species of thought. Frank took a drink of coffee and waited. Finally, she picked up the screwdriver. The first time she slipped and nearly stripped the screw head, Frank said, "You're pressing like you think metal owes you obedience." Amy did not look up. "I'm pressing like the screw is too small." "It's not too small. You're sloppy." She stopped moving then, just long enough for him to know the sentence had landed where it needed to. That became the rhythm of it. 3 mornings a week. Sometimes in the training room, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in Frank's cramped office with old blueprints hanging behind her and the smell of paper dust and machine grease in the air. She learned torques by feel because Frank refused to let her trust numbers alone. She learned what cold did to old housings, what vibration looked like before it sounded like anything, what a sensor mount said when it had been over-tightened by somebody trying to compensate for ignorance with force. She hated being corrected in silence more than she had ever hated being spoken down to. Frank discovered that early and used it with care. Once 6 weeks in, she held a bracket in one hand, frowned at the slight warp in it, and said, "This would still pass visual." Frank nodded. "And it would still fail under heat." He nodded again. Amy set it down. "That's annoying. It is if you like making assumptions." She gave him a flat look. "You enjoy this too much." "Not enough." She almost smiled. That was the first real progress. Now, 6 months later, they stood beside line 4 while Amy bent over an open panel with a tool in one hand and a flashlight clipped to her collar. Her sleeves were rolled. There was a grease mark on the side of her wrist she either hadn't noticed or had stopped caring about. The line was down for scheduled maintenance. The usual industrial pulse had been interrupted, leaving the floor quieter in a way that made every dropped bolt sound important. Frank stood beside the cabinet, not touching anything. Amy adjusted the bracket, then checked the sensor seating again with her fingers before tightening the last screw. No hurry, no performance, just attention. Tom passed behind them with a clipboard and slowed. "She's still alive in there?" Amy didn't look up. "Barely." Tom grinned and kept moving. Frank watched the angle of her wrist, the pressure she used, the moment she stopped before over-tightening and corrected by instinct rather than instruction. When she was done, she leaned back and wiped the heel of her hand on her work pants. "Check it," she said. Frank stepped in, laid his fingers against the mount, tested the tension, looked at the alignment, then nodded once. Amy crossed her arms. "Well, you did it." She squinted at him as though waiting for the insult hidden inside the sentence. It didn't come. After a second, she said, "You satisfied?" Frank closed the panel. "You can do the work." Amy looked at the cabinet instead of at him. "I still don't like you." Frank said, "I don't need you to like me." That finally made her look at him. He added, "I need you to be good." Amy held his gaze a moment longer than she had 6 months ago, without turning it into a contest. Then she nodded once, small enough that anybody not looking for it would have missed it. "I know," she said. That was the closest thing to an apology he expected from her. It was enough because it cost her something to say it that plainly. Mark came down from the mezzanine a few minutes later, carrying a tablet and wearing the look he had learned over the past 6 months. The one that said he now knew enough to be embarrassed by half the things he'd once thought counted as progress. "How's it look?" Amy answered before Frank could. Sensor seating was off by less than a millimeter. It'd have drifted by winter if nobody caught it. Mark looked at Frank. Frank said, "She caught it." Amy looked away at once, as if praise in front of witnesses was still a form of exposure. Mark took that in and nodded. "Good." There was no speech after that, no ceremonial exchange, just the three of them standing beside a quiet line in a plant that had learned, by inches and humiliation and money, how much easier it was to modernize a building than a hierarchy. Later that week, Tom dragged Frank out for one beer after shift because one beer was the only kind of invitation Frank ever said yes to without argument. They sat at a scratch table in the same local place as always, Tom talking about a broken sump pump at his sister's house, Frank pretending not to be interested, and then giving a full 5-minute answer about what was probably wrong with it. Nothing had changed there, which was its own relief. Tom still interrupted. Frank still pretended to be annoyed by it. They still sat in companionable silence long enough that people younger than them would have mistaken it for a problem. At one point, Tom said, "You know, if you start getting soft on those kids, I'm quitting." Frank looked at him. "You're not quitting anything." Tom took a sip of beer. "True." That was enough. The small sign went up without anyone telling Frank about it. He saw it on a wet November evening, nearly 8 months after the day of the line failure, when he came in through the side lot and happened to look toward the main entrance instead of straight down at the puddles like he usually did. The company sign over the door had been cleaned. Not replaced, just cleaned. The old metal washed down so the letters showed brighter against the gray. Beneath it, mounted on a narrower plaque near the brick column, was a second line in smaller lettering. Frank R., 35 years. Frank stopped in the rain and read it twice. Nothing dramatic happened. No soundtrack rose in his chest. No one came out to surprise him. The parking lot remained what it was. Wet asphalt, truck lights at the far dock, the smell of diesel and cold metal. A puddle near the curb shivered under light wind. He stood there with his coat collar up and rain ticking faintly off the hood of the car beside him. Honorary engineer. He almost disliked the phrasing. Too sentimental, too close to ceremony. But the number beneath it, 35 years, sat there without embellishment, and that did something to him the title didn't. 35 years. Not a punchline. Not a burden to be retired out of the room. Not an old man slowing the future down. A record. A fact. Tom came up behind him with his own collar turned up and followed Frank's line of sight. "Well," Tom said, "look at that." Frank did not answer. Tom shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. Mark's idea? Probably. Amy approved the mounting bracket. That made Frank glance sideways. Tom grinned. "I'm kidding." Frank looked back at the plaque. The rain had started to bead on the metal already. The letters shone and blurred slightly under the lot lights. His eyes stung once, briefly in the cold. He blinked and looked away toward the shipping bay, then back again. Tom said nothing this time. That was another kind of friendship too, knowing when not to fill a moment just because the silence had become visible. After a while, Frank said, "It's too small." Tom snorted, "Yeah, there he is." Frank kept looking at the sign. Could have made the lettering bigger. "I'll file a complaint." "Do that." Tom nudged his shoulder once with the back of his own. "You done standing in the rain like a widower in a movie." Frank gave him a flat look. Tom said, "That's a yes." They went back inside. That night, Frank drove home through dark streets shining with leftover rain. The wipers made their steady pass. Red brake lights smeared briefly in the glass ahead of him and disappeared at each intersection. He did not turn on the radio. The truck heater clicked and blew air that smelled faintly dusty, like the first week it got cold every year. At the house, he parked, went inside, and turned on the kitchen light. The room came up all at once. Counter, refrigerator, chair, the same worn floor, the same small, ordinary life waiting where he had left it. The photo of his wife was still on the fridge door, held there by the same chipped magnet. Her face caught in that same interrupted smile, as if someone had called her name just before the picture was taken. Frank stood in the kitchen with the keys still in his hand. Then he set them down, walked to the refrigerator, and looked at the photo for a while. "I did it," he said. Not loudly, not like an announcement. He opened the refrigerator, took out a beer, twisted off the cap, and drank standing there in the white kitchen light. The beer was cold and bitter, familiar. He had once stood here and drunk alone because the house had felt emptied out and the plant had felt lost and everything in him had gone mean with humiliation. Tonight the house was still quiet. His wife was still dead, the plant was still a factory full of noise and compromise and people who would always need watching. Amy was not his friend, Mark was not suddenly family. He was not happy in the clean movie sense people used when they wanted endings to behave. But he was no longer the man from the meeting room. No longer the joke in the video. No longer the old body everyone was politely waiting to clear out of the way. He took another long drink and set the bottle on the counter. The kitchen was still quiet. The refrigerator still hummed. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in a slow, irregular line. Frank looked once more at the photo on the fridge. Then he turned off the overhead light, carried the beer into the dim house, and let the quiet come around him again. It was not joy. It was not peace. But it was different. And different was enough.